On a stormy night in Chicago, a black father struggles to push a squeaky grocery cart through the streets with his daughter. Desperation clings to him. No home, no stable job, no way out, only a single source of income from washing dishes. But when they come across a woman stranded with a luxury car, he offers to help, even at the risk of losing the only money keeping them afloat. What he doesn't know is that the woman is the CEO of a major automotive company, and the kindness he just gave is the very thing that will change his life. The rain hammered against the cracked pavement, turning the Chicago streets into a network of shimmering puddles and murky streams. Darius Carter tightened his worn-out jacket, pulling Ariel closer as she skipped beside him, her tiny pink rain boots splashing with every step. The cold wind bit through the fabric, but he barely noticed. His mind was heavy with the weight of the day, a weight that had been pressing down on him for months. His last paycheck was gone. His landlord had given them until sunrise to clear out. There was no backup plan. No safety net. Just the bag slung over his shoulder and the small hand gripping his fingers. "Daddy, look." Ariel's excited voice cut through his thoughts. She pointed across the street to where a sleek silver Mercedes was parked at an awkward angle, its hazard lights blinking in the darkness. A woman stood beside it, struggling with a flimsy umbrella, her other hand gripping a phone as she barked something into it. The tension in her posture was unmistakable frustration, helplessness, urgency. Darius hesitated. He needed to get to the diner. It was just a dishwashing job, but it was a shift, something to keep them moving forward, even if only by inches. But then Ariel tugged his sleeve. "She looks sad," she murmured, peering up at him with those wide brown eyes. "Maybe we can help." A sigh escaped him, curling into the cold night air. He was tired. Tired of fighting, tired of struggling, tired of always being the one to do the right thing when the world never seemed to return the favor. But he couldn't say no to Ariel, not when she still believed in kindness like it was a law of nature. "All right, kiddo," he said, forcing a smile. "Let's go see." They crossed the street, rain beating against their shoulders, and as they got closer, the woman turned to face them. Her sharp features were partially obscured by damp strands of blonde hair sticking to her forehead. She was dressed in a tailored navy blue coat, but it did little to shield her from the storm. Darius lifted a hand in greeting. "Flat tire?" The woman looked him over quickly, and he knew the moment she made her assessment. Her grip on her phone tightened slightly, eyes flicking between him and Ariel. A black man in ragged clothes, approaching her at night. Suspicion flashed across her face before she masked it with forced politeness. "Yes," she said, shifting uncomfortably. "I called roadside assistance, but they're taking forever, and I have a meeting." "I can change it," Darius interrupted, not interested in her explanations. He'd seen that look before, felt that hesitation. He knew how this worked. She didn't trust him, but she also didn't have another option. The woman blinked, caught off guard. "Are you sure? It's pouring. And she glanced at Ariel, your daughter." "She'll be fine," Darius said evenly, rolling up his sleeves. "I've done this 100 times. Ariel beamed, stepping forward to hold the umbrella over her father as he crouched beside the car. "My daddy's really good at fixing things," she said cheerfully, directing the comment at the woman. "He says kindness is free, so we should share it with everyone." The woman let out a small, almost reluctant chuckle, but Darius didn't look up. He worked quickly, muscles moving on instinct despite the rain numbing his fingers. The whole process took less than 15 minutes. By the time he stood up, wiping his wet hands on his jeans, the new tire was in place. The woman exhaled in relief. That was fast. She pulled a wallet from her coat pocket and held out a crisp $100 bill. "Here." Darius barely hesitated before shaking his head. "No need. Just happy to help." The woman hesitated. He could feel her staring at him, could practically hear the calculations running through her mind. The way her gaze drifted over his tattered shoes, the damp patches on his sleeves, the tired lines around his eyes. A man like him shouldn't be refusing money. "At least let me give you a ride," she said instead. "You're soaked." Darius hesitated. "We're headed to?" "Wherever it is, I'll take you," she insisted. "It's the least I can do." The words were polite, but her tone wasn't a request. It was a decision, a verdict. Like she had already made up her mind that he needed her help, that whatever she assumed about his situation had been confirmed by his refusal to take the money. Darius clenched his jaw, debating whether to refuse outright, but then Ariel looked up at him, eyes filled with excitement at the idea of a warm car, and he exhaled. "All right," he muttered, "thanks." As they climbed into the Mercedes, the woman turned slightly in her seat, finally offering her name. "Eleanor Hastings." Darius froze. The name was familiar, too familiar. He'd seen it on billboards, on business magazines, in the news. CEO of Hastings Automotive, one of the biggest tech-driven auto companies in the country. But instead of reacting, he simply nodded. He wasn't about to make a fuss. She was just another person, another stranger passing through his life. Ariel, on the other hand, was unfazed. She babbled happily during the ride, talking about how she and her dad always helped people and how kindness was important. Eleanor listened with an odd expression, half amused, half something else, something unreadable. When they reached the rundown diner, Eleanor pulled out a small notepad from her bag. "Give me your number," she said, "in case I have another flat tire." Darius hesitated but eventually scribbled it down on a scrap of paper. He had no illusions. She wouldn't call. People like her never did. Still, as he stepped out into the rain once more, he glanced back just in time to see Eleanor watching him through the windshield, her expression unreadable. And then she drove away, leaving him standing in the storm, the weight of the night settling on his shoulders once again. The next 2 weeks passed in a slow, grinding blur, each day heavier than the last. The rain never seemed to stop, seeping into every crack of the city, just as the weight of Darius's situation seeped into every corner of his mind. The eviction had come swiftly, mercilessly, as if the universe itself had been waiting for him to fail. The diner job had fallen through before it even began. The manager had hired someone else, someone who could start immediately. Now, he and Ariel were stuck in a cycle of cold nights spent in shelters when space was available, in their car when it wasn't. The money he'd scraped together from odd jobs barely covered food. His phone's screen was cracked, but it still worked though no one called, least of all Eleanor Hastings. Not that he'd expected her to. He tried not to let Ariel see the worst of it, tried to keep the fear out of his voice when she asked why they couldn't go back home, why they had to move from place to place. She was resilient, stronger than any 7-year-old should have to be, but he saw it in her eyes, the creeping understanding that something was very, very wrong. It was on one of those nights, when the cold had settled deep into his bones and he'd spent hours trying to find work, any work, that his phone finally buzzed with an unknown number. He stared at it for a long moment before answering. Darius Carter. The voice on the other end was smooth, professional, but unmistakable. His grip tightened. "Yeah. This is Eleanor Hastings. Do you have a moment?" His breath stalled for half a second before he forced himself to answer. "Yeah, sure." "I've been thinking about that night," she said, as if she were discussing the weather. "And about you." Darius frowned, unsure where this was going. "All right. I ran your name," she continued, unfazed. "Looked into your work history." A slow wave of irritation crawled up his spine. Of course she had. People like her always did things on their terms, moving pieces around the board without asking if anyone wanted to play. "Didn't realize I was being investigated." There was a brief pause, then a dry chuckle. "You fixed my car in the pouring rain and didn't take my money. Forgive me for being curious." Darius exhaled, pinching the bridge of his nose. He didn't have time for this. "Look, Ms. Hastings, if this is about charity—" "It's not," she cut in, her voice sharp, decisive. "My company is expanding. We're opening a new manufacturing facility, and frankly we need people who actually know what the hell they're doing. I saw your records, your past work at Wexler Auto. You were one of their best mechanics before the company shut down. That's not something I ignore." Darius went still. "I need a lead mechanic for our maintenance team," she continued. "Someone I can trust to handle things without needing their hand held. If you're interested, we can talk details." His heart pounded against his ribs. He almost laughed at the absurdity of it. A job. A real job. Not some one-off gig, not a patchwork of side hustles that barely kept them afloat. A real, stable, paying job. But then doubt slithered in, wrapping around his thoughts like barbed wire. People like her didn't just offer opportunities like this. There was always a catch. "Why me?" His voice was quieter now, but firm. You could hire anyone. Someone with more connections. More. He hesitated, then exhaled, the bitterness slipping through before he could stop it. Someone who fits in better with your kind of people. Another pause. When Eleanor spoke again, her tone had shifted. You think I'm handing you this because I feel sorry for you? I think, Darius said carefully, that people like you don't usually notice people like me unless it benefits them. A silence stretched between them, thick, charged, and then, to his surprise, she let out a short laugh, low and humorless. You're not wrong. That admission caught him off guard. But you should know something, Carter, she went on, voice steady. I grew up in a house that barely had heat in the winter. I know what it's like to watch your parents break their backs just to keep the lights on. And I know how fast people like me forget where they came from once they have enough money to pretend they were never there. Darius clenched his jaw, unsure how to respond. This isn't charity, she said again, more forcefully this time. I don't hire people because I feel bad for them. I hire them because they're good. You're good. And I need good people. He sat there, the weight of her words settling into his ribs. He wanted to say yes. God, he wanted to. But the part of him that had been beaten down by years of disappointment, of being overlooked, of being second-guessed, whispered warnings in the back of his mind. What's the catch? He asked finally. You prove yourself first, she said without hesitation. 30-day probation. You work, you get paid. You do the job right. The position is yours permanently. You screw around, I find someone else. A test. It made sense. It was fair even. And yet, part of him still bristled at the idea of having to prove himself to someone who had likely never had to prove herself a day in her life. But then he thought of Ariel, curled up in the back seat of their car last night, her tiny body shivering despite the blankets he'd wrapped around her. He thought of the way her voice had wavered when she asked if things would get better. He closed his eyes. When he opened them, he took a breath and answered, When do I start? Darius stood outside the Hastings automotive facility, gripping the strap of his worn-out duffel bag as the morning sun glared off the massive glass windows of the main office. The building loomed over him, a sleek, modern structure of steel and tinted glass, a stark contrast to the run-down garages and auto shops he was used to. His stomach twisted with a familiar knot of unease. It wasn't just nerves, it was the feeling of stepping into a world that wasn't built for him. A world where men like him were only ever seen in coveralls with their heads down, fixing things in the background. Ariel clung to his side, her small fingers curling around his wrist as she gazed up at the building with wide eyes. Is this where you're going to work, Daddy? She asked, her voice laced with excitement and something else, hope. Yeah, baby, Darius murmured, forcing a smile he didn't quite feel. This is it. He led her toward the entrance, where a receptionist greeted him with a polite but stiff expression, her eyes flicking over his faded jeans and scuffed boots before settling on Ariel. You must be Mr. Carter, she said, her tone clipped. Miss, Hastings is expecting you. Darius nodded, keeping his face neutral, as the woman picked up the phone and murmured something too quiet for him to hear. A moment later, Eleanor appeared at the end of the hall, her sharp heels clicking against the pristine tile floor. She was dressed in a crisp gray blazer and slacks, her hair pulled back into a sleek ponytail. She moved with purpose, her gaze scanning Darius as she approached, assessing him in that way she always seemed to. You're on time, she noted, as if mildly surprised. Figured that'd be a good start, Darius said dryly. Her lips quirked, but she didn't smile. Instead, she looked down at Ariel, who clung to Darius's leg, but stared back at Eleanor with unfiltered curiosity. I thought we agreed he'd start today, the receptionist interjected, her tone shifting ever so slightly, an edge creeping into her voice. Is she going to be staying here? Darius stiffened. He recognized that tone. The barely concealed irritation. The unspoken assumption that his daughter was a problem, that she didn't belong. He opened his mouth to respond, but Eleanor beat him to it. She'll be fine, Eleanor said, her voice cutting through the air with quiet authority. She turned to Darius. We have an employee daycare down the hall. You can leave her there while you're working. Darius hesitated, glancing down at Ariel. You okay with that, baby girl? Ariel looked up at him, then back at Eleanor, then finally nodded. Yeah. I can make new friends. Eleanor gave a slight nod, then gestured for Darius to follow her. He walked beside her through the facility, past towering machinery and gleaming assembly lines. The smell of oil and metal filled the air, familiar and grounding. "Let's get one thing straight," Eleanor said as they moved past a group of workers, all clad in identical Navy uniforms. "I didn't hire you because I like you. I hired you because you know your way around an engine, and I need this place running at full efficiency." Darius smirked. "Trust me, I wasn't under any illusions that you liked me." She shot him a sidelong glance but continued. "Your job is to lead the maintenance team, make sure these machines don't break down, and fix them when they do. But you're on probation. You mess up, you're out. Understood?" Darius nodded. Crystal clear. They stepped into the main garage, where a group of men stood huddled near a row of workstations, talking in low voices. As soon as Eleanor entered, they straightened, their conversations halting. Darius felt their eyes land on him, scanning, measuring, judging. "Everyone," Eleanor announced. "This is Darius Carter. He'll be overseeing maintenance." A beat of silence stretched through the room before one of the men, tall, broad-shouldered, with a thick beard and a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes, stepped forward. "Overseeing maintenance, huh?" The man crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. "That's funny. I thought we already had people for that." Eleanor's tone didn't change. "And now you have someone better." A murmur rippled through the group, quiet but unmistakable. The bearded man's smirk widened. "Better, huh?" He tilted his head, eyes narrowing slightly. "No offense, boss, but you sure about that?" I mean, his gaze slid to Darius, slow and deliberate. Seems like he's still getting his bearings. Darius knew exactly what that meant. The underlying meaning behind those words. He'd heard it before, in different forms, from different men who all looked at him the same way. Eleanor's expression was unreadable, but there was an edge to her voice when she responded. "If you have an issue, Marcus, you can take it up with me. Otherwise, get back to work." Marcus held her gaze for a beat too long before giving an exaggerated shrug. "Just making conversation," he said lightly, but there was a weight behind it, something unspoken. Then, with a smirk that made Darius's hands itch, he turned and walked away. Eleanor exhaled sharply, as if holding back something sharp-tongued, then turned to Darius. "Welcome to the job," she muttered before striding off. Darius stood there for a moment, letting the tension settle. Then he rolled his shoulders, turned toward the workstations, and got to work. The first week passed in a grind of long hours and silent tests. Darius kept his head down, focused on the machines, the work, the familiar rhythm of metal and oil. He didn't need to win anyone over, he just needed to do his job, to prove, not to them, but to himself, that he belonged here. But the hostility in the garage hung thick in the air, unspoken but undeniable. The way the other mechanics would exchange glances when he walked in. The way conversations would quiet whenever he approached. And Marcus, always watching, always smirking, always finding little ways to remind Darius that this wasn't his space. It was in the small things. The missing tools when he reached for them, the forgotten instructions that left him fixing mistakes that weren't his. It was in the way Marcus would laugh just a little too loud, making some joke just low enough for Darius to know it was about him, but not loud enough to call him on it. Still, Darius swallowed it down, grinding through each day. He had Ariel to think about. He had no room for pride. He took every setback in stride, knowing that proving himself meant more than fighting battles that weren't worth it. Then the machine broke. It was a press, one of the biggest in the facility. A multi-million-dollar piece of equipment that shaped the aluminum body frames before they moved down the line. When it stopped working, everything stopped. A halt like that. It cost the company thousands of dollars every hour. Darius was working on a conveyor belt in the back when he heard the commotion. Eleanor was already there when he arrived, standing with arms crossed, her expression unreadable as a handful of engineers and managers stood around the silent machine. Marcus was there too, leaning against a toolbox, watching. "Let me guess," Marcus drawled, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Must been some bad luck bringing in new management." Darius ignored him, stepping forward. "What's the issue?" One of the engineers, a wiry man in a crisp uniform, shot him a look of skepticism but answered anyway. The press started making an off-rhythm grinding noise this morning. Then it just stopped altogether. We already tried a soft reset, checked the pneumatic systems, nothing. Darius nodded, already running through possible causes in his head. The press was massive, but the problem had to be internal, something disrupting the normal cycle. Who was working on it last? He asked. Marcus gave an exaggerated shrug. Couldn't tell you, we all do our part. Darius ignored the jab, moving toward the control panel. The screen blinked with error codes, but he barely glanced at them. Error codes only told part of the story. What mattered was the sound, the feeling of the machine itself. He stepped up to the main body of the press, running a hand along its frame, feeling the vibration low, uneven, like a beast still breathing but barely. He knew this kind of machine. He'd worked on older models before. He glanced at the floor beneath it. Oil, just a faint trace, but enough to confirm his suspicion. Hydraulic issue, he muttered. He turned to Eleanor. You got schematics? She nodded toward one of the engineers, who handed him a tablet. Darius studied it for only a few seconds before setting it down and rolling up his sleeves. I need access to the lower panel. Can someone pull it? The engineers hesitated, exchanging glances. One of them, a younger guy, moved as if to help, but Marcus let out a low chuckle. Man, you serious? Marcus shook his head. You think you're going to fix this thing like it's some old junker in a backyard shop? You don't just look at it and figure it out. Darius clenched his jaw. He could feel all the eyes on him waiting. For what? For him to snap, to back down. He turned, locking eyes with Marcus. Yeah, he said simply. That's exactly what I do. And then, without another word, he dropped to one knee, reached under the machine, and got to work. It wasn't easy. The space was cramped, the bolts rusted from years of exposure, and the hydraulic system was nestled deep in the frame. But Darius had done harder things, in worse conditions, with worse odds stacked against him. He worked by feel, by instinct, letting his hands tell him what the machine couldn't. It took 40 minutes. 40 minutes of sweat, of ignored comments from the men watching, of biting his tongue every time he heard Marcus scoff. But when he tightened the last bolt, when he stood up and wiped the grease from his hands, he knew. Try it now, he called. One of the engineers hesitated before moving to the control panel, fingers hovering over the restart sequence. Then, with a deep breath, he pressed the button. A low hum. A pause. Then the press came to life, metal groaning as the massive machine roared back into motion, the rhythm smooth, uninterrupted. The silence that followed wasn't the silence of failure. It was the silence of disbelief. Darius exhaled, rolling his shoulders back. Looks like it's not junk after all, he muttered. Eleanor was the first to speak. You just saved us thousands in downtime, she said, her voice even, controlled. But there was something in her eyes, a flicker of something she hadn't expected to find. Marcus's jaw was tight, his smirk gone. Guess we got lucky, he muttered. Darius wiped his hands on a rag, meeting his gaze head-on. Guess so. And just like that, the balance shifted. The shift in the garage was subtle at first, but Darius felt it. It was in the way the conversations didn't die as quickly when he walked in the way some of the younger mechanics started asking him questions instead of ignoring him. Respect wasn't given in places like this, it was earned. And whether they liked it or not, he had earned it. But not everyone was ready to accept that. Marcus had been quieter since the press incident, but that didn't mean he was done. If anything, his silence felt more dangerous, like a storm waiting for the right moment to break. Darius wasn't naive. He knew men like Marcus, men who had spent their whole lives secure in the idea that their place in the world was unshakable, that people like Darius belonged beneath them, invisible until needed. And when that balance got disrupted, they didn't let it slide. The hit came at the worst possible time. It was a Friday afternoon, near the end of the shift. The facility had been running smooth all week, no major breakdowns, no setbacks. Darius was starting to think, just maybe, this could work. He could make this stick. And then, right when he was finishing up an inspection, Eleanor's voice cut through the noise of the garage. Darius, she called from across the floor. A word. He wiped the grease from his hands as he approached, already feeling the eyes on him. Conversations quieted. Eleanor didn't call people out unless it was serious. She folded her arms, her face unreadable. I just got an incident report. Darius frowned. What incident? Eleanor held up a clipboard. A faulty recalibration on line 2. One of the hydraulic arms nearly crushed a casing. You signed off on the maintenance check. Darius stiffened. That's impossible. Eleanor didn't blink. It happened. His pulse pounded against his skull. He had checked line 2 himself, double-checked it. I didn't miss that, he said, his voice firm. Then how did it happen? Eleanor's tone was neutral, but he knew she was testing him, waiting to see if he'd crack. Darius turned, scanning the room. The others were watching, but one person wasn't just watching, he was smirking. Marcus leaned against a workbench, arms crossed, looking entirely too pleased with himself. Darius knew in an instant. It had been him. A sabotage, small enough to avoid immediate catastrophe, but big enough to get Darius blamed. His fingers curled into fists, a fire burning in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. If he lost his temper now, it was over. That's what Marcus wanted. He exhaled through his nose, meeting Eleanor's gaze. Give me 20 minutes, he said. I'll find the problem. Her eyes flicked toward Marcus, then back to him. She hesitated, then handed him the clipboard. 20 minutes, she agreed. Darius turned and strode toward line 2, barely hearing the murmurs that followed. He could feel Marcus's eyes on him, feel the unspoken challenge in the air. But Darius didn't engage. He had a job to do. He went over every bolt, every calibration point. It took 15 minutes to find it the slightest misalignment in the pressure sensors. Not something that would be caught on a quick scan, but enough to cause the malfunction. The kind of mistake a real mechanic wouldn't make. The kind of mistake someone had to create. He straightened, wiping the sweat from his brow. He could march over to Marcus, throw the evidence in his face, demand Eleanor take action. But men like Marcus were careful. He'd deny it, act offended, make it a he said situation. And if Darius lost his cool, that would be all the excuse they needed to write him off. No. If Marcus wanted to play a game, Darius would play smarter. He grabbed a wrench and adjusted the calibration, fixing the issue in under a minute. Then he turned, walking back to Eleanor, holding the clipboard out to her. Fixed, he said. She scanned his face. And? Darius glanced at Marcus, then back at her. He saw the unspoken question in her eyes. Did he know what had really happened? Of course he did. But instead, he just said, must been a mistake. Eleanor's gaze lingered on him for a moment longer than necessary. Then, slowly, she nodded. She turned to the room, raising her voice just enough. Line 2 is cleared. Back to work. The tension broke. The men shuffled back to their stations, and Marcus. He didn't look quite so smug anymore. Darius met his eyes, just for a second, and gave him the smallest nod. Message received. Marcus didn't own this place. And if he wanted Darius gone, he was going to have to try a hell of a lot harder. The 30-day probation ended with little ceremony. There was no grand announcement, no formal meeting. Just an email from HR confirming his full-time position, a company badge with his name on it, and a set of keys to the maintenance office. The job was his. Darius stared at the badge for a long moment, fingers tracing the embossed letters. It should have felt like a victory, but he knew better. This wasn't the finish line. It was just another starting point. Marcus had been quieter since the line 2 incident, but Darius wasn't naive. The man wasn't the type to let things go. Still, he wasn't his concern anymore. His concern was Ariel, and for the first time in too long, he could finally give her some stability. That afternoon, he picked her up from the company daycare, where she greeted him with an excited grin, showing off a crayon drawing of their new lifer. Him, and a big house with flowers out front. Do you like it? She asked, eyes bright. Darius swallowed past the lump in his throat. Yeah, baby girl, like it a lot. As they walked toward the parking lot, Eleanor was waiting by his car. She was dressed down for once, a simple blouse and slacks instead of her usual corporate armor. She held a coffee in one hand, her expression unreadable as always. Carter, she greeted. Boss, he returned. She smirked. You can call me Eleanor now. You made it. He raised an eyebrow. So that's it? I'm in? She sipped her coffee. You were in the second you fixed that press. This was just to see if you'd quit before we got here. Darius huffed a laugh, shaking his head. Figures. She hesitated then, glancing at Ariel before looking back at him. Listen, I don't do this often, but I wanted to say something. You were right back when we first talked. People like me don't usually notice people like you. And when we do, it's not always for the right reasons. Darius didn't respond. He just let her talk. I didn't help you because I felt bad. I helped because I saw someone who deserved the chance. But that doesn't change the fact that I get to make decisions like that, and you don't. She exhaled, as if frustrated with something she couldn't quite name. I don't know if that's fair. Darius tilted his head. It's not. Eleanor nodded, as if she expected that answer. Well, maybe that's something I can work on. He studied her for a moment before finally asking, why me? She took another sip of coffee, considering. Because you remind me of someone. My dad. He worked in a shop just like this, fought to keep us above water when no one else would give him a shot. He died before I ever made it out of that life, but I think if someone had just given him the right opportunity, things might been different. She glanced at him. So maybe I was trying to fix something I couldn't back then. Darius let out a slow breath. He hadn't expected that. Ariel tugged at his hand, oblivious to the weight of the conversation. Daddy, can we get ice cream? Darius chuckled, ruffling her curls. Yeah, baby girl, we can do that. He looked back at Eleanor, who gave him the faintest nod before stepping away. See you Monday, Carter. See you Monday. As he lifted Ariel into the truck, he glanced down at the badge still in his hand, the weight of it settling in. This wasn't luck. It wasn't charity. It was earned. And for the first time in a long, long time, the road ahead didn't feel impossible. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.